Taxes are front and center in politics, in the economy, in pretty much everything we do. Some would say that there are politicians who are weaponizing taxes, either towards the rich or towards small business, or the opposite way. But taxes are front and center. And today we're going to discover not just how big an issue tax policy is on our lives, and not just our income tax, but how the taxes work and how that tax policy works. But we're also going to discover some things we can do about it. What can we do with with the coming elections? What can we do with our own taxes? So we have a very special guest with us today, Scott Hodge. It is such a privilege to have you from the Tax Foundation. And Scott, if you'd give us just a little of your background. Scott has written a book called Taxocracy: What You Don't Know About Taxes and How They Rule Your Daily Life. And give us just an inkling of your background there. There it is. Awesome. I love it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. It's great to be with you, and your show, of course, is so popular among entrepreneurs and investors, and that's a tribute to the work that you do. My background, I was president and CEO of the Tax Foundation for the past 22 years. I stepped away last year or the year before to write this book and to get more engaged in the coming tax debates as an author. Prior to coming to the Tax Foundation, I worked at other think tanks, including the Heritage Foundation for 10 years. And prior to that, a small think tank in Chicago called the Heartland Institute. So I've been in the think tank business now for about 35 years, and it's been my passion to change tax policy in a free market direction so that both the economy and entrepreneurs and ourselves have more liberty and more freedom.
So let's start with that. It seems like taxes actually have become a bigger political issue. Yeah. First of all, we had AOC wearing the tax the rich dress, to the Met. We have President Biden running on tax increase as a good thing, which is honestly shocking, given that most presidents in the past have run on lower taxes, not higher taxes. And first of all, can we start with how do we get here? I mean, why is it that taxes have become such front and center? And it seems like there are certain parts of the administration, certain parts of the country that have decided that more taxes is a good thing.
I think there's a growing populism, especially on the left, that wealth, inequality, and success are bad things. And the way to deal with that in their mind is to raise taxes on the wealthy, onto entrepreneurs, onto businesses, and successful people. Wealth taxes have become the new sin tax. Politicians use sin taxes a lot. They try to raise tobacco taxes to keep you from smoking. They put taxes on beer and alcohol to moderate drinking. Well, taxes on success and wealth have become the new sin taxes, and they're being promoted as a way of reducing something that they consider to be a social problem. And at the bottom of that is inequality, which they see as a bad thing. Now, inequality can be a bad thing in totalitarian governments or societies where the rich and the politicians can plunder an economy. But in a free market economy, inequality is a natural outcome of ability, different skill sets, different interests, free will. And essentially, these kinds of taxes are a tax on free will and ability. And it's a true problem, I think, in America today to see these kind of taxes rising and being promoted as a good thing, as you say, by the likes of President Biden.
So how do we get here? I mean, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, it's not more than the last 10 years. that we've started seeing this. Why? Where do you think it came from, and where do you think it's going?
It, well, I think these things come in waves. I've been doing a little bit of history of reading, and you know, some of the early move to create an income tax in America in the early part of the 1900s came out of this sort of ferment that,
Sure.
oh my gosh, you know, there are all these, you know, industrialists that are becoming successful. They have all this wealth. There's all of this inequality. And so there's a wave in America of this sort of anti-success, anti-business, anti-investor, anti-capitalism sentiments, and we're in the throes of that. Uh, how did it come so quickly? Well, you know, it could be the rise of global trade, and people have inherent sort of fear of that, that look, our jobs are being shifted abroad, or we're lacking competitiveness, or because we have a global market, that people like an Elon Musk and a Zuckerberg and so forth can become super rich because they deal in global markets. That scares people, and I think we're seeing some of that. It's just an unfortunate byproduct of having a global marketplace where these kind of companies can become globally successful. And as a result, you know, years ago, a rich person may have been the local banker. Well, today it can be a global capitalist dealing in global markets. I think it's a good thing because they're creating products that make our lives so much better and increase wealth society in society.
Yeah,
And that's
I do find it interesting that the same people that complain about it are the ones who are using Amazon the most. And they're the ones who are buying the Teslas. So I find it fascinating that people don't vote with their pocketbook. Rather, they go. It's kind of like George Bernard Shaw's famous quote, right? Any government that robs Peter to pay Paul will always have the support of Paul. And right now it's just like, okay, well, you know, it at least looks like what's going on is you have a candidate for presidency who's running on buying votes, literally buying votes with tax credits for children, to be offset with this so-called billionaires tax, which is a tax on people over $100 million, not a billionaire's tax.
right.
And so by itself, it's a lie. But let me ask you another question. So how is it that people are so ill-informed and are so easily have the wool pulled over their eyes that they don't understand that in 1913, when we got the income tax in the first place, it was really a billionaire's tax. I mean, effectively, it was on a very small portion of the population. And then it wasn't until 1944 where it started to be a tax on wages. And even then, it was only a tax on wages in excess of what your normal living expenses was. And then all of a sudden now it's become routine. And of course, Milton Friedman contributed to this, and he regretted this. And I remember he's quoted as saying that one of his biggest regrets is being part of the withholding tax, because it takes it out of the view of the public. It makes it's not shown, and it's just, okay, that's just the way it is. And so here we are. So what are some of the things that you're seeing? Let's take some specifics. What are some of the things that you're seeing when you talk about the world ruled by taxes, your taxocracy? What are some of the examples of that you're seeing right now?
Well, look, how the Biden, as you mentioned, the Biden administration is trying to use tax policy to incentivize or get involved in all manner of things, the kind of cars you buy. Now we have these very big subsidies to buy electric cars. And so you see entire industries now, running after these kinds of incentives. Right now, corporate tax departments are becoming profit centers as they're reshaping their business in order to comply or chase after these huge subsidies that are flowing through these environmental and green energy tax credits. But on the other hand, in simple things, You look, we have a child tax credit, and then we have a tax credit for putting your kids in daycare. We have a tax credit for taking care of grandma. We have a tax credit for putting a solar panel on your roof and buying energy efficient washing machines. We have tax credits for buying a house, of course. And then we have multiple types of tax deductions and credits for different savings options. It's very, very complicated. There are over 220 different tax cuts and credits and deductions in the tax code, and they seem to be multiplying and making the tax code that much more complicated. It's a wonder why everybody feels like they have to pay somebody else or use TurboTax or something in order to do their taxes, because they have become so complicated and our lives are so entwined in the tax code. And it's especially bad for entrepreneurs. You've got to figure out, well, do I become a C Corp, an LLC? Do I incorporate and become a corporation? There are various tax ramifications for all those decisions.
Well, this is all the Accountants Full Employment Act, as we know, and those of us who are accountants are very appreciative. When the 2020 election was going on, people asked me, "So, do you like Biden or do you like Trump?" And I said, "Well, Trump is good for our taxes, but Biden would be good for my business." And it's proved out. Biden was very good for my business. But let me add a couple of other things. What about even the fact that to get the major solar tax credits, you have to pay union labor. You have to use union rules. So now we're not just talking about an industry. We're talking about those who are coordinated in this industry, and those who these are very clearly specific political favors. And how do we get to these very specific political favors being passed by Congress?
That's the history of the tax code, it is the history of political favors. My recent work research is on the tax exempt economy, nonprofits. Well, that goes back to the first tax code that was written in 1894, and they started exempting lots of industries and sectors from the tax code. That was later shot down by the Supreme Court, but the 2013 or the 2009 corporate income tax, they started rebuilding that and exempting all kinds of industries and sectors and organizations from the tax code. That is the history of the tax code, is political favoritism or punishment. Politicians see the tax code as one of two things: a way of rewarding political supporters and punishing those who are disfavored.
So it's both the carrot and the stick.
Very much so.
Both the carrot and the stick. So let's talk about some of those so I'm sure that you and I are some of the few people in this country who have actually read Biden's budget and his green book. So let's talk about some of those, because I go back to 2021. We had Build Back Better, and I actually did an interview back then. And the estate tax that they had proposed ended up being in total about 92%. If you add it all in between the capital gains tax, the capital gains tax increase, the estate tax, all of those things added in, we actually calculated it was about 92% estate tax in the Build Back Better bill, if all of it were enacted. Okay, so let's look at what has survived that. We know that it got trimmed down, and that some of what happened with the Build Back Better ended up in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. That's where some of it went. Of course, this is a little like Costco having the big screen TVs and the jewelry up front, so that by the time you get to the back and you're paying $15 for a jar of mayonnaise, it seems like a good deal. Where it seemed like it's only a $2 trillion bill instead of a $6 trillion bill. Wow, this is a good deal for us. What are some of the things you're most concerned about in the Biden budget? Because we know that while that's not going to be enacted this year, if the Democrats do come to power, and we do know that there are going to be changes in 2025 and 2026 by necessity, okay, because the phase out of the 2017 law. So what are some of the things that you see that are most egregious, and and then we'll talk about what you see as most likely.
Mm. Well, I would start on the corporate side because the U.S. once had the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced our corporate rate to 21%, made that a permanent part of law. But Biden wants to raise that tax back up to 28%, which, when you would add on the state taxes, would make us have, again, one of the highest corporate tax rates in the industrialized world, and would undermine U.S. competitiveness. And he would raise some of the other international taxes that were created during the 2017 Act that, again, would punish our U.S. corporations for doing business globally and trying to be competitive globally. So I worry about that. We're also seeing some other bad policies toward corporations. He's got the stock buyback tax. It was a 1% tax that was put into the Inflation Reduction Act. And no sooner was that passed than he was proposing to quadruple it to 4%. And so then companies are then put in this dilemma of, well, do we buy back stock with our surpluses? Or do we pay out dividends, or we just retain earnings? And we shouldn't be forced to make those decisions. So those are excuse me, up front. But then on the individual side, he would raise the capital gains. Well, first raise the individual tax rate from 37% to 39.6%. He would increase the net investment tax from 3.8 to 5%. So now we're starting to see that top rate move into the 40s. For millionaires, he would apply the capital gains rate at the individual rate, which then would mean a capital gains rate in the 40s. But if you add on state taxes, some of those folks would pay more than 50% on their capital gains. Then, of course, there's that wealth tax, the not so billionaires tax, as you would like to call it. And I think that is a completely unworkable tax, to be honest with you, and a little frightening, because one of the ways that they're trying to get at you, you would have to create an asset registry, and every year you would have to document your assets and show them to the IRS so that they could figure out how much you owe in taxes. So, it's easy with stock and other tradable assets to figure out what their value is, more or less. But other things like a private company, your art collection, your homes, other things, you would have to actually come up with a value of those every year and provide those to the IRS. I think that is one of the most dangerous and scary aspects of that proposal.
Well, but that only applies to people making over 100 million, that have over $100 million of net worth, so to speak. Okay, so that's not going to affect the rest of us. But isn't that the same argument that was made when they were trying to pass the 16th Amendment?
Yes, and we've seen that writ large over the entire history of the tax code. Remember, the alternative minimum tax was was created in the 1960s and then 70s, really aimed at high-income individuals who were using too many deductions to lower their tax bill. Guess what? Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act fixed the AMT, 5 million taxpayers were being affected by it every year. And so we see this over and over again throughout the tax code. Little provisions that were supposed to aimed at only the rich end up hitting the middle class and everyone else.
Yeah, it seems like there's an insatiable hunger for tax revenue by people who it's somebody else's money. So therefore it's okay to take somebody else's money. It's okay to use somebody else's money, as long as we do good with it. Right. So let's talk about, if we can, shift a little bit to some of the small business tax provisions in the Biden budget, because I think there's some very serious provisions in there, starting with the net investment income tax on business earnings.
Yes.
which it's not right now on business earnings. It's only on passive earnings. But that's a 5% tax that increases basically the small business tax rate, adds another 5% tax, regardless of whether you're an S corporation, doesn't matter. It's going to apply.
It's about a $600 billion tax increase on entrepreneurs and small businesses in the Biden budget. Not only the net investment tax, but some of the other taxes that they would apply to pass through businesses. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out the impact of that on entrepreneurship and small businesses. And Tax Foundation has modeled the Biden budget to look at its macroeconomic effects. We think our model indicates that it would lower the size of the economy by about 2%. It would cost almost 800,000 jobs as a result. It would increase the cost of capital, meaning we'd have less capital investment in the economy. This is a very anti-growth budget plan or tax plan. And so, you talk about how should we think about the next election? The economic future of America is dependent upon it.
So, okay, so we've got the 5%. The capital gains tax, of course, is going to affect any entrepreneur who sells their business, right? Because if you double the rate, now you have modeled in the past. My recollection is Tax Foundation has modeled in the past that once we get past a 28% rate, you actually have a decrease in revenue. Are you seeing that in this situation as well, where it actually decreases revenue to the government?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't looked at that aspect of our modeling, but I suspect that would be the case, that it would taper off, that, there is a limit to how much you can actually tax capital income before it changes. And, we've seen this historically. Back after the 1986 Act, taxed capital gains at the individual tax rate. And we saw a decline in capital gains realizations during that period of time. So there's historical precedent for the effect of these kinds of taxes on capital income, capital investment. And I think we need to be extremely cautious about allowing politicians to try to tax capital income like this.
Okay, so we've got all these things. They seem to be anti-business. What do you see as so wrong with the corporate tax increase, where these are just corporations, right? I mean, this is the argument you always hear. Well, it's the big bad corporations. Who owns the corporations in this country?
Mm-hmm. Well, we do through our retirement funds and our savings, et cetera. Americans own our corporations. It's a very, very democratic process. And I think by raising the corporate tax, you end up taxing average Americans. Look, there's a hierarchy of tax harm that economists have discovered. The corporate income tax, is the most harmful tax for economic growth. Why? Because capital is the most mobile factor in the economy, and thus it's the most sensitive to high tax rates. Individual income taxes are second most harmful because we can decide not to work if the taxes go too high. And then you get down to things like sales taxes or consumption taxes are less harmful. And then the least harmful are property taxes because property is fairly immobile. It's not to say that all of those things aren't an impact, but that's the hierarchy you have to think about. And so with Biden attack on U.S. corporations, that will have the biggest impact on economic growth over the long term.
So, I'm curious, have you looked at, and how do you feel about how this tax discussion right now, the so-called tax the rich discussion, how do you think it affects the American psyche, the American dream, the way people look at America?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, and I'm worried because this sort of class warfare can have such a big impact on the future of the tax code. Let's not forget that next year, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, all of the individual tax cuts that were passed in 2017, they will expire at the end of next year. So we should be having a very rigorous discussion about the future of the tax system. And number one, it would be a shame to allow those tax cuts to expire because of the impact on the economy. But it also ought to be an opportunity to rethink and say, hey, maybe this is an opportunity to remake the tax code to make it even more pro-growth. To move away from income-based taxes to a more consumption-based, increase the amount of savings in capital investment so that we can have a more robust economy. That's the discussion that we should be having and that we're not having today because one, you have Biden using class warfare, and then Trump right now is basically ignoring tax
Yeah,
policy,
he
except
is.
when it comes to tariffs. And I think this is a missed opportunity on his part and by Republicans in general. And this should be a very vigorous discussion right now.
No, agreed. So I'm going to ask you now to take out your crystal ball, Scott. And what do you think is what 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 do you think is most likely to happen
Yeah.
in 2025 or 2026? Because we know that politicians sometimes wait until the year after it expires and then they pass it retroactively. So I'm not going to say that it's absolutely going to happen in 2025 because we know it may not. What is most likely going to happen? What do you think most likely will stick around? And what's most likely going to change?
Well, there's a little bit of precedent here that maybe we can draw from. Remember, it was a little over a decade ago, back in 2010 and 11,
Yep.
when the Bush tax cuts were
Right.
expiring. And we saw a compromise there between Paul Ryan and President Obama. And they extended most of those tax cuts, made them permanent. They did allow, however, an increase in some of the top rates. And that was their political compromise. Would that same compromise happen next year? Well, it may depend, but there are wrinkles in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that make it very different from that fiscal cliff that we had over a decade ago, because we have things like the SALT deduction,
Right.
which was restricted in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You have other sort of base broadeners because in order to sort of pay for the tax cuts in 2017, they had to raise taxes elsewhere by broadening the tax base. So that's an element that was not there a decade ago when Obama and Paul Ryan were negotiating. That makes it a much more complicated compromise situation because many Democrats in those blue states like New York and Connecticut and New Jersey and Illinois and California want to lift the SALT cap and give their rich people a tax cut. And how is that going to affect the overall decision about extending all the tax rates? I don't know.
You know,
I think it's going to be,
that's an interesting one by itself, Scott, because there
yeah.
are some that would say that the SALT deduction, that was a weaponization of the tax law against the left coasts. And
Yeah,
I can see from a pure policy standpoint. I mean, I know that's been on the docket for 40 years. When I was in Washington, it was on the docket. We
yeah,
know it's it was a big revenue raiser. Frankly, it doesn't make any sense we have any SALT deduction, in my opinion.
agreed.
But there are those who would say, well, wait a minute, that's just using the tax code against those states that the administration didn't like.
Yeah, that's a phony argument for this reason. Prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what were the thing that the people in blue states were complaining about? The
Alternative minimum
alternative
tax.
minimum tax. And then
Right.
the P's provision, which also
Yep.
restricted
Yep. The
your
2%.
itemized deductions. Well, the 2017 Act eliminated the P's deduction. It
Right.
increased the threshold on the AMT, and then it created a SALT cap. Well, There was a salt cap prior to 2017. It was
Right.
just done
So it was called
surreptitiously.
the AMT.
It was called the AMT,
Right.
which everyone was complaining about. So this is just giving them something else to complain about.
So, so what's your advice to entrepreneurs, investors, people who are looking at this and going, whoa, these are enormous tax hikes. I mean, potentially enormous tax hikes. What's your advice? What's your advice to the small business community?
Yeah, that's I wish I could say I guess they're going to have to rise up as a group and join forces to demand that and prevent these tax increases from going into place. It will really take grassroots effort. You know, talk to your local congressman or congresswoman. Get engaged in the policy debate. I know it's so hard when you're trying to build a business to then have to pay attention to what's going on in Washington. But the future of the business will often depend upon that engagement. But get educated too. You know, the Tax Foundation has a wonderful website with all kinds of educational
For
material.
sure.
You can buy Taxocracy and learn more about how taxes
Or
impact
tax-free wealth.
or
There you go.
tax-free wealth.
There you go.
Uh, Learning is the biggest thing. And, you know, we were talking earlier about why do people seem so ill-informed? Well, tax illiteracy is a big problem in America.
Mhm.
You
It
know
is.
how many people love to get that refund after tax day? Well, you've just given the government a
Right.
tax-free loan for
Exactly.
a year, or an interest-free loan. So we have to do more, I think, to educate people and to build up their tax literacy, their tax IQ, so that they aren't bamboozled by the political rhetoric that we hear so often in Washington.
I 100% agree and appreciate you writing your book. And this is why I write books on tax and how to explain it. One final question, if we can, and that is the Inflation Reduction Act
Yeah.
added $80 billion. Some of it's been taken away, supposedly, in the budget compromise. What do you think is the future of that money and what the IRS is doing? Because that impacts all of every entrepreneur that impacts, because that's frankly, that's who the IRS is going after. They're not going after the billionaires. The IRS is going after the small business owners. And let's just be really clear about that. That's who they're going after.
Yeah, I wish that money would be put into making the IRS, putting the service back into the IRS.
Amen.
And right now we have a tax collection agency that's much more of a benefit delivery agency because of all of the
Right.
programs that it's essentially managing through the tax code. And you know, you try to call the IRS, you can't get an answer. They need to put the service back into the IRS and make it a helpful agency, not one that's harassing taxpayers and legitimate businesses. And that's the unfortunate thing, is this demand for a few more dollars worth of tax revenues by putting more enforcement. The key to actually raising more revenue is to simplify the tax
Right.
system and broaden the tax base. But no, we're asking the IRS to be a super agency managing all kinds of programs through the tax code. That is not the function nor the skill set of a tax collection agency. Let's get it back to basics, simplify the tax system, make it neutral to decision making and economic decisions, and allow it to just be that rather than an agency that harasses Americans.
Do you think that that money will stay? Do you think that that they're going to have those appropriations for the next 5, 6 years?
Well, at least right now, the House of Representatives and with Republicans in the leadership there are not allowing that to move forward. And so we are seeing some pushback on that. And they're trying to redirect, either stop that increase or redirect it towards something else. I mean, look, over the last 40 years, the IRS has spent about $12 billion in order to increase its computer systems so that it can manage paper tax returns. It's still investing
Yeah.
money and trying to figure out how to, they're hand entering paper tax returns. Look, what century is this? We have an agency that's backwards technologically, and it needs to put more emphasis on that rather than harassing people.
Yeah, I would love to see. I don't have an objection to the money going to the IRS. I have an objection to what it's used for. I would love to see it used in technology and service.
Yep.
And really focus on that, and then maybe focus on the people who are actually cheating, which, as you know, tends to be the people who make less than 200,000, not people who make more than 400,000. We recently had that report that I'm sure you've seen that said that initiative to go after the high income, actually they found that the high income people have only half as many mistakes, or they only have half as many returns that actually have changes as they would if they were when they're auditing the lower income.
Yeah, and things like the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, have a huge amount of problems in terms of overpayments, in some cases outright fraud, mostly mistakes. The earned income tax credit has an error rate of about 25%, which is over $20 billion worth of mistakes. You add on that the child tax credit and some of these other tax credits are ripe with problems, and the IRS can't seem to fix it. So, that's where a lot of these issues are, not at the high end where, people use accountants and lawyers to create good tax returns.
Yeah. Speaking of bad tax policy, let's talk on the ERTC, which employee retention credit, which I don't know why we need employee retention credit in 2024. Not sure why that can't be shut off. And there's a proposal in Congress that would shut that off. At the same time, would bring back bonus depreciation retroactively and bring back the R&D expense deduction. Is that dead? Can we just pronounce that dead now?
I guess hope springs eternal, but sadly, time seems to be running out on that. And the longer we go into the year, I think that the chances of that passing become smaller and smaller, unfortunately. And the worst aspect of that is the fact that they're allowing bonus depreciation to expire. Mm-hmm. Our tax model finds that expensing is the most powerful engine for economic growth. And it helps lower the cost of capital investment. It allows entrepreneurs to put tools in the hands of their employees to make them more productive. It is so pro-growth, and yet we are allowing it to expire. And I think that's a political tragedy.
Yeah, I agree. And I my studies of other countries show that many other countries allow full expensing. So it is also a competitiveness issue that we have vis-a-vis other countries who are allowing the full expensing. But Scott, really appreciate you being on today. Again, the book is Taxocracy: What You Don't Know About Taxes and How They Rule Your Daily Life. And I would suggest get that, combine it with tax-free wealth, learn what you can do about your taxes. And when you do, you'll always make way more money and pay way less tax. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.